大家好，这里是大脑透镜，我们致力于过滤垃圾信息，挖掘优质内容。今天我们来分享美国财政部长贝森特前几天在 IIF， 也就是国际金融协会年会上的主旨演讲。我们一句话总结他这次演讲，就是他给 IMF 和世界银行指明了方向，不忘初心，牢记使命。大脑透镜将用7张幻灯片向您讲解这次演讲的要点。如果您需要幻灯片的话，请至 Patreon 下载，我们把链接放在留言区。在开始之前，我们快速的介绍一下贝森特的背景。可能很多朋友已经知道，他毕业于耶鲁大学政治学专业，之后加入了不同的对冲基金。这里我们略过，介绍几个关键的。时间来到1991年，他加入了索罗斯基金，4年担任伦敦办公室的负责人，在索罗斯的指挥下操盘做空英镑，赚了10亿美金，也有的说有12亿美金。8年后，他选择离开，创立了自己的对冲基金，还在耶鲁大学担任兼职教授。2011年，他又回到索罗斯基金，担任首席投资官，亲自指挥、亲自部署做空日元，赚取超过10亿美金。2015年离开，再次创立自己的对冲基金。去年底来到了人生的又一个高峰，担任美国第79任财政部长。可以说他的人生是高潮一个接一个。我们有一期视频专门讲他在索罗斯基金操盘做空英镑和日元的，有兴趣的朋友可以听一听，链接我们放在留言区。演讲开始，他直接将我们带入了2战后期的布雷顿森林会议。他说，这个会议决定建立 IMF， 也就是国际货币基金组织和世界银行，初衷是为了恢复和维护经济平衡，促进货币合作和金融稳定。但是经过几十年，现在的现实非常残酷。他说，今天是随处可见的不平衡，不公平贸易体系导致美国持续的贸易逆差，其他经济体过度依赖美国的需求。的确美国是全球最大的客户。一些国家的政策鼓励过度储蓄或压低工资，这里是特指中国了。后面的采访环节他也会反复提到中国，总计有10多次吧。既然现状是不平衡，那么就需要再平衡。他表示 IMF 偏离本职工作太久了，过多的关注气候问题和其他问题。他特别强调，现在的这种情况是不可持续的。 Sustainability 可持续性这个词语很流行，但是他说的不是气候变化和碳足迹，而是经济和金融可持续性。的确最近10几年，可持续性这个词语几乎已经完全被完成了一个环境保护的专有名词。他说 IMF 要回到本业，重新聚焦货币、贸易和经济增长。他赞扬了阿根廷的进展，批评了中国的政策。世界银行的问题跟 IMF 一样，偏离使命太久，需要回到初心，也需要改革。他强调技术中立，要支持优先使用技术可靠的能源。这里是暗批绿色能源不太可靠。他还说中国可以毕业了，中国不再是发展中国家。他认为中国过度依赖制造业和出口，造成了严重的失衡。他说中国自己也很清楚，强调这不仅损害中国，也损害整个世界。中国的双循环不能光说不做。他批评中国的政策是扭曲和不透明的，比如补贴和货币操纵。他还表示世界银行不应该继续将中国列为发展中国家，也就是他前面提到中国应该毕业他重申中国应该从出口驱动转向消费驱动经济，还特别强调中美应该合作和对话。这个味道和中国公开的立场是一样的他澄清美国优先并不是美国孤立，而是要加强美国的领导力，推动全球秩序的重塑，推动公平、稳定与合作。那我们今天就分享到这里，如果您需要幻灯片，可以到 Patreon 下载，链接我们放在留言区置顶。接下来是完整版，它的语速很慢，建议在学英文的朋友可以听一听这个语速非常适合初学者，词汇量呢偏国际政治、经济和金融多一点。谢谢大家。
好的，谢谢，感谢你的精彩介绍。能站在这里是一种荣幸。在第2次世界大战的最后几个月，西方领导人召集了他们那一代最杰出的经济学家，他们的任务是构建一个新的金融体系。在新罕布什尔州山间的一处宁静度假胜地，他们奠定了美国制式 Pax Americana 的基础。布雷顿森林体系的设计者们认识到，全球经济需要全球协调。 为了促进这种协调，他们创立了国际货币基金组织 IMF 和世界银行。这对双子机构诞生于地缘政治和经济剧烈动荡的时期。国际货币基金组织和世界银行的宗旨是更好地协调国家利益与国际秩序，从而为不稳定的世界带来稳定。简而言之，他们的目标是恢复并维持平衡，这仍是布雷顿森林机构的核心使命。然而，今天我们审视国际体系时，处处可见失衡。好消息是，情况并非必须如此。今天上午，我的目标是勾勒出一份蓝图，恢复全球金融体系及其支撑机构的平衡。我职业生涯的大部分时间都在金融政策圈外观察，现在我身处其中，向外展望。我渴望与你们每一位合作，重建国际体系的秩序。然而，要实现这一目标，我们必须首先重塑国际货币基金组织和世界银行，或者使其重新回归其创始使命。这些机构具有持久价值，但使命偏离已使其偏离正轨。我们必须实施关键改革，确保布雷顿森林机构服务于其利益相关者，而不是反过来。恢复全球金融的平衡，需要国际货币基金组织和世界银行展现清晰的领导力。今天上午，我将阐述他们如何发挥领导作用，构建全球范围内更安全、更强大、更繁荣的经济。我诚邀我的国际同行加入我们，共同努力实现这些目标。在这一点上，我想明确一点，美国优先并不意味着美国孤立，相反，这是对贸易伙伴间更深入合作和相互尊重的号召。美国优先绝非退缩，而是寻求扩大美国在国际货币基金组织和世界银行等国际机构中的领导力。通过承担更强的领导角色，美国优先旨在恢复国际经济体系的公平性。我之前提到的失衡在贸易领域尤为明显，因此，美国现在正采取行动重新平衡全球贸易。几十年来，历届政府依赖错误的假设，认为我们的贸易伙伴会实施促进全球经济平衡的政策。然而，我们面临的是不公平贸易体系导致的巨大且持续的美国贸易逆差。其他国家刻意的政策选择削弱了美国的制造业，破坏了关键供应链，使我们的国家安全和经济安全面临风险。特朗普总统已采取强硬措施，应对这些失衡及其对美国人的负面影响。巨大且持续的失衡现状不可持续，这对美国不可持续，对其他经济体最终也不可持续。我知道可持续性在这里是一个流行术语，但我指的不是气候变化或碳足迹，我指的是经济和金融稳定。这种可持续性能够提升生活水平，维持市场运转。如果国际金融机构要成功履行其使命，就必须专注于维护这种可持续性。针对特朗普总统的关税公告，超过100个国家已主动联系我们，希望协助重新平衡全球贸易。这些国家对总统创造更平衡国际体系的行动做出了公开且积极的回应。我们正在进行有意义的讨论，并期待与其他国家进一步对话。中国尤其需要重新平衡。近期数据显示，中国经济进一步从消费转向制造业。如果现状持续，中国以制造业出口驱动增长的经济体系将与其贸易伙伴造成更严重的失衡。中国当前的经济模式依赖通过出口摆脱经济困境，这是一个不可持续的模式，不仅损害中国，也损害整个世界。中国需要改变，这个国家知道它需要改变，每个人都知道它需要改变。我们希望帮助它改变，因为我们也需要重新平衡。中国可以从减少出口过剩产能转向支持本国消费者和国内需求开始。这种转变将有助于实现世界迫切需要的全球重新平衡。当然，贸易并非全球经济失衡的唯一因素。对美国需求的持续过度依赖导致全球经济越来越不平衡。一些国家的政策鼓励过度储蓄，阻碍了私营部门主导的增长。其他国家人为压低工资，也抑制了增长。这些做法导致全球对美国需求的依赖来刺激增长，同时也使全球经济比应有的更加脆弱。在欧洲，前欧洲央行行长马里奥·德拉基指出了经济停滞的几个根源，并提出了一些建议以重振欧洲经济。欧洲国家应认真考虑他的建议。欧洲已经采取了一些早就该采取的初步措施，我对此表示赞赏。这些措施创造了新的全球需求来源，同时也涉及欧洲在安全领域的加强。我认为全球经济关系应反映安全伙伴关系，安全伙伴更有可能拥有相互兼容的经济结构，构建互利的贸易。如果美国继续提供安全保障和开放市场，那么我们的盟友必须在共同防御上做出更坚定的承诺。欧洲在增加财政和国防开支方面的初步行动证明，特朗普政府的政策确实有效。特朗普政府和美国财政部致力于维持并扩大美国在全球的经济领导力，这在国际金融机构中尤为重要。国际货币基金组织和世界银行在国际体系中扮演着关键角色，特朗普政府渴望与他们合作，只要他们能忠于其使命。但在现状下，他们未能达到目标。布雷顿森林机构必须摒弃其庞杂且缺乏重点的议程，这些议程已削弱他们履行核心职责的能力。未来，特朗普政府将利用美国的领导力和影响力，推动这些机构完成其重要使命。美国还将要求这些机构的管理层和员工对取得实质进展负责。 我邀请你们所有人加入我们，共同努力，使这些机构重新聚焦于其核心使命。这是我们的共同利益所在。首先，我们必须让国际货币基金组织重新成为国际货币基金组织，其使命是促进国际货币合作，推动国际贸易的平衡增长，鼓励经济增长，并遏制竞争性汇率贬值等有害政策。这些功能对支持美国和全球经济至关重要。然而，国际货币基金组织已因使命偏离而偏离轨道。他曾坚定不移地致力于促进全球货币合作和金融稳定，现在他却将过多时间和资源投入到气候变化、性别和社会问题上。这些问题并非其使命，其在这些领域的关注挤占了对关键宏观经济问题的工作。国际货币基金组织必须成为对所有成员国毫不留情的真相揭示者。今天，国际货币基金组织却在掩耳盗铃。其2024年外部部门报告标题为"失衡正在消退"。这种过于乐观的看法表明，该机构更致力于维持现状，而非回答棘手问题。在美国，我们知道需要整顿财政秩序。上届政府创造了我国历史上和平时期最大的赤字，本届政府致力于解决这一问题。我们欢迎批评，但我们不会容忍国际货币基金组织不对最需要批评的国家，主要是顺差国家提出批评。根据其核心使命，国际货币基金组织需要点名像中国这样几十年来推行全球扭曲性政策和不透明货币做法的国家。我还期望国际货币基金组织指出某些债权国的不可持续放贷做法。国际货币基金组织应更积极地推动官方双边债权人尽早与借款国合作，最大限度减少债务困境期。国际货币基金组织必须重新聚焦于解决国际收支问题的贷款，且贷款应为临时性的。负责任的贷款是国际货币基金组织对全球经济贡献的核心。当市场失灵时，国际货币基金组织介入并提供资源，作为交换，各国实施经济改革，解决国际收支问题，并支持经济增长。这些项目中的改革是国际货币基金组织对强大、可持续、平衡全球经济最重要的贡献之一。阿根廷是一个恰当的例子。本月早些时候，我访问了阿根廷，以展示美国对国际货币基金组织帮助该国重塑财政的支持。阿根廷因在实现财务基准方面取得实质进展而值得国际货币基金组织的支持，但并非每个国家都如此值得。国际货币基金组织必须要求各国对实施经济改革负责，有时国际货币基金组织需要说不。该组织没有义务向未能实施改革的国家放贷。经济稳定和增长应是国际货币基金组织成功的标志，而非其放贷的金额。世界银行像国际货币基金组织一样，世界银行也必须重新适配其使命。世界银行集团帮助发展中国家发展经济，减少贫困，增加私人投资，支持私营部门就业创造，并减少对外援的依赖。它为各国提供透明且可负担的长期融资，以投资于自身发展优先事项。世界银行与国际货币基金组织一起为低收入国家提供广泛的技术支持，促进债务可持续性，使这些国家能够抵御其他债权人强制性和不透明的贷款条件。世界银行的这些核心功能与特朗普政府推动美国及全球更安全、更强大、更繁荣的经济的努力相辅相成。但与国际货币基金组织一样，世界银行在某些方面偏离了其最初使命。世界银行不应再期待为其空洞的流行语营销和半信半疑的改革承诺开具空白支票。随着世界银行回归其核心使命，它必须尽可能高效、有效地利用资源，并以展示对所有成员国切实价值的方式做到这一点。世界银行现在可以通过专注于增加能源获取来更高效地利用资源。全球商界领袖将不可靠的电力供应视为投资的主要障碍之一。世界银行与非洲开发银行联合推出的使命300计划，旨在为非洲3亿人扩大能源获取，这是一项值得欢迎的努力。但世界银行必须响应各国的能源优先事项和需求，专注于能够持续经济增长的可靠技术，而不是追求扭曲性的气候融资目标。我们赞赏世界银行最近宣布将寻求取消对核能支持的禁令，这可能为许多新兴市场带来能源供应的革命性变化。我们鼓励世界银行进一步为各国提供所有能够提供可负担基础负荷发电的技术。世界银行必须在能源投资中保持技术中立，优先考虑可负担性。在大多数情况下，这意味着投资于天然气和其他化石燃料能源生产。在其他情况下，这可能意味着投资于可再生能源，并配备系统来管理风能和太阳能的间歇性问题。人类历史教给我们一个简单的教训：能源充裕引发经济繁荣。因此，世界银行应鼓励全面发展的能源开发方式。这种方式将使世界银行的融资更有效，并使其重新连接到经济增长和减贫的核心使命。除了增加能源获取外，世界银行还可以通过开始实施其毕业政策更有效地利用资源。这将使世界银行专注于向较贫困、信用较差的国家放贷。这正是世界银行支持对贫困和增长影响最大的地方。然而，世界银行每年继续向已满足毕业标准但仍借款的国家放贷，这种持续放贷毫无道理。它耗尽了更高优先级的资源，挤占了私人市场的发展， 还削弱了各国从依赖世界银行转向以私营部门为主导、创造就业的增长的努力。未来，世界银行必须为早已满足毕业标准的国家设定明确的毕业时间表。将世界第二大经济体中国视为发展中国家是荒谬的。尽管以许多西方市场为代价，中国的崛起迅速且令人印象深刻。如果中国希望在全球经济中扮演与其实际重要性相称的角色，那么该国需要毕业。我们对此表示欢迎。世界银行还应实施基于最优价值的透明采购政策，它必须帮助各国摆脱仅优先考虑最低成本投标的采购方式。这种采购政策奖励扭曲性和补贴性的产业政策，破坏发展，还可能抑制私营部门，激励腐败和勾结，并导致长期成本增加。基于最优价值的采购政策从效率和发展角度都更优，其强有力的实施将惠及世界银行及其股东。关于这一主题，我想对乌克兰的采购政策发出强烈且强调的信号。任何为俄罗斯战争机器提供资金或供应的人都将没有资格获得为乌克兰重建 Dearmark 的资金，任何人都不行。最后，我邀请我们的盟友与我们合作，重新平衡国际金融体系，使国际货币基金组织和世界银行重新聚焦于其创始章程。美国优先意味着我们将加倍努力参与国际经济体系，包括在国际货币基金组织和世界银行。一个更可持续的经济体系将更好地服务于美国和其他所有参与者的利益。我们期待与你们所有人共同努力实现这一目标。谢谢。接下来是访谈部分。感谢你，部长先生。感谢你今天加入我们。感谢大家今天来到这里。我想指出，你的演讲内容非常丰富且全面，你有很多精彩的语句，但你说，我想明确，美国优先并不意味着美国孤立。相反，你并非退缩，而是寻求扩大美国在国际货币基金组织和世界银行等国际机构中的领导力。我必须说，这座城市现在集体松了一口气，因为本周之前的担忧是你会做你说不会做的事，即美国会退出。但你想领导，你要求的只是回归出厂设置，对吗？采取专注的方法处理你认为最重要的问题，对吗？对的。正如我在确认听证会上所说，我认为美国与国际金融多边机构的接触，我们应该参与其中，并且要为美国人民、其他国家和客户国家争取胜利。20年前，一位美国财政部高级官员发表了类似的演讲，呼吁国际货币基金组织行动，说国际货币基金组织在处理失衡问题上睡着了。汉克·保尔森启动了与中国的战略经济对话。此后，每位财政部长都有自己的方法。那么，你将如何与众不同？你认为你将如何推进这种方法？你的哲学是什么？你的工具是什么？你将如何执行？我认为我们重新调整金融或贸易体系的行动是一个开始。我认为今天我重申了我们的参与，但为这些机构设定了一份核心原则清单，回归基本面。再次，作为来自私营部门的人，我们希望看到结果，我们希望看到时间表。正如我们后台讨论的，全球重新平衡已经是一个超过20年的话题。有些国家可能有100年的视角，但我们没有。中国显然是本届政府外交和经济政策的重要组成部分。你将与你的中国同行会面，你会告诉他们什么？关于他们显然知道存在巨大失衡，他们的制造业产能巨大，特别是在汽车等领域。你将如何帮助他们理解这不仅仅是空谈，而是要执行？我认为我不需要帮助他们理解。我认为他们非常清楚，这只是动力和意愿的问题。我相信我在1990或1991年第一次去日本，那是在泡沫顶峰后的12个月内，那10年是经济低迷的10年。然后在2011或2012年，我遇到了一个竞选首相的人，名叫安倍晋三，他知道日本需要改变，并迅速实施了改革。10年后，10多年后，日本经济表现非常出色。我认为我们的中国同行也会意识到这一点，我们的一些政策有时需要外部推动，对吧？或者正如我之前所说，这里有一个重大交易的机会，美国希望重新平衡，增加制造业，这意味着减少消费。如果中国认真减少对出口导向制造业增长的依赖，并重新平衡向国内经济，我认为他们使用了双循环这个术语。现在它实际上是单一循环。如果他们想重新平衡，我们一起做，这是一个不可思议的机会。我认为，如果桥水基金创始人雷戴利奥要写些什么，他可能会称之为美丽的重新平衡。但这其中很大一部分也将是我们自身的财政失衡。正如你提到的，我们在周期顶部的赤字占 GDP 的6%，你自己也指出这是不可持续的。解决我们的财政失衡作为更大重新平衡的一部分有多重要？这非常重要。我认为在座的大多数人是训练有素的经济学家，每个人都知道贸易逆差来源于3个方面。外部贸易政策，我们正致力于解决这些问题。外部贸易政策可以是关税、非关税壁垒、货币操纵以及国家对劳动力和生产手段的补贴。所以，贸易条件或贸易监管是一个方面。第二是我们的预算赤字，赤字越大，越会造成需求吸入，同时推高利率。第三是美元的水平，我们继续坚持强势美元政策， 美元将根据市场调整。每个人都问我，强势美元意味着什么？对我来说，强势美元意味着制定值得资本流动和信心的政策，但这并不意味着彭博屏幕上每天的价格，它在双边价格方面也有不同的含义。所以这是一个三管齐下的问题。但回到你的问题，我说过，我们不是一夜之间走到这一步的。美国没有收入问题，我们有支出问题。2年前，我第一次与特朗普总统会面，讨论加入他的竞选活动时，我建议我们需要回到一个长期可持续的预算赤字，比如3%开头的水平，这是可行的。我们有2%的名义增长或2%的通胀，预计1.8%的增长。我认为，如果我们实施我们的经济政策，这个数字可能会高得多。你重申了由鲍勃·鲁宾首次提出的强势美元政策。瓦莱利·吉斯卡尔在1960年代谈到美元的过渡特权。这座城市里有些人质疑这种特权，实际上认为它是一种负担。你认为这是一种特权吗？美国处于全球经济的中心，是美元的使用促成的，这种使用量随时间减少是自然的。我认为在我的有生之年，美元将始终是储备货币。我其实不确定其他人是否想要这个角色，我记不清了。今天一位欧洲官员，也许是杜恩多斯先生，我记不清了，说欧元可能会成为第2储备货币。你知道欧元刚刚大幅升值，对于出口经济体，这是一个很大的压力。我认为重申我们对这些国际机构的信念也是其中的一部分。你提到了欧元，你在评论中提到了去年的马里奥·德拉吉报告，之前还有一份报告。我最近在欧洲花了很多时间，欧洲似乎有一种更加乐观的氛围，他们认为这是一个机会。我提到过邮政复兴，被稍微嘲笑了一下，但我实际上对欧洲相当乐观。你认为这是一个转移需求的机会吗？世界一直依赖美国的最终需求，现在可以将部分需求转移到欧洲，这对欧洲来说是一个积极的时刻吗？我认为可能是的。这不是一条直线，也不是训练有素的外交官会做的方式，但我认为我们都应该祝贺特朗普总统。他完成了过去26年自欧元诞生以来，法国、意大利等欧洲国家试图让德国增加财政支出，推动欧洲经济的努力。我赞赏这些努力，因为这是一个经济刺激和欧洲大陆防务负担分担的结合。我多次说过，经济安全就是国家安全，国家安全就是经济安全。如果这个欧洲计划成功，我会表示赞赏。2周前，我与西班牙财政部长私下会面，他说：“你会为我们在未来几天或董事会的军事开支新方向感到惊喜，重新回到出厂设置的方向。你想从他们那里听到什么？”再次强调，这只是使命偏离。你知道，偶尔你得修剪花园里的杂草。我认为这需要回归基本面。我们的优先事项是什么？我们如何判断成功？关于世界银行，你谈到了一些早就应该毕业的中等规模国家，这改变了世界银行的商业模式，但显然你认为这很重要，他们需要毕业。是的，的确，正如特朗普总统所说，这是常识。你不能让世界第2大经济体既享受快速增长，又被视为发展中经济体。我有一个青少年，有时想被当作孩子，有时想被当作大人，我也有一个这样的孩子。是的，这是一个成熟的经济体。你提到能源，特别是核能，在竞选期间和担任部长以来，你谈到能源生产是你的重要支柱之一。美国每天生产约1300万桶石油，是世界上最大的生产国。我们这里还需要做什么？世界银行需要做些什么来更多的鼓励化石燃料以及核能？我假设是全面发展。是的，经济增长的必要条件是能源充裕。我们需要推动这些国家以可持续的方式实现爬走跑的正确组合。但我说的可持续是指稳健的基础负荷，而不是我们在西方几乎可以称之为奢侈信念的东西。他们担心抽水、取暖、医院运营。我们看到间歇性能源不起作用，即使在中等发达国家，比如南非，似乎有轮流停电，对吧？所以这不是一个模型。我们想要一个强大的基础负荷模型，然后再附加替代能源生产，而不是从替代能源生产开始，然后有这种延迟或间歇性，使工业化变得不可能。在最后的1-2分钟，我想谈谈金融中介。你知道有句名言，没有资本的资本主义只是另一种主义。你在这里看到的机构在资本市场和其他形式的金融中介中都是重要的中介人。你对美国金融监管的愿景是什么？你希望这个行业是什么样子？显然，美国资本市场是经济的瑰宝。我们如何在国内和国外鼓励这一点？我认为我收到了很多关于私募信贷的问题。我认为私募信贷是美国经济格局的一个有趣补充，是我们资本和信贷市场的深度和广度推动了美国经济那里的创新。我认为私募信贷是一个非常新且有趣的部分，但它发生在监管生态系统之外，对吧？我总是说我不是经济学家，我是经济历史学家。我认为这是一个系统的扭曲。这告诉我，2008年后的监管束缚对受监管机构来说太严格了。我们希望放松监管， 或使他们更能以智能、安全和稳健的方式为美国经济甚至国际经济提供贷款机会。我们看到金融危机的历史是一方面的过度反应，我认为我们有过监管过度反应。我在美国召集了一个叫做金融稳定监督委员会 FSTOC 的东西，它召集了监管机构。我认为通过与联邦储备委员会、货币监理署和联邦存款保险公司这3个美国银行监管机构的合作，我们可以建立一个让受监管金融系统再次繁荣的体系。美国与其他G7国家不同的是，我们的金融机构数量众多，我们没有5家或3家大银行。在美国，社区和小型银行提供了70%的农业贷款，40%的中小企业贷款，40%的房地产贷款。在美国，我们在华尔街经历了这场不可思议的繁荣。我认为华尔街可以继续表现良好，但我认为现在轮到主街分享繁荣了。我认为是小型银行在全球金融危机后的退缩导致了主街的停滞。我们决心解决这个问题。我总是说，财政部是理性的声音。今天我们从你这里听到的是理性的声音。祝你一切顺利，女士们、先生们，为财政部长鼓掌，谢谢。
大佬透镜提醒您，接下来是英文原声的完整版。
Good, thank you. Excuse me. Good, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. In the final months of World War II, Western leaders convened the greatest economic minds of their generation. Their task? To build a new financial system. At a quiet resort high up in the mountains of New Hampshire, they laid the foundation for Pax Americana. The architects of Bretton Woods recognized that a global economy required global coordination. To encourage that coordination, they created the IMF and the World Bank. These twin institutions were born after a period of intense geopolitical and economic volatility. The purpose of the IMF and the World Bank was to better align national interests with international order, thereby bringing stability to an unstable world. In short, their purpose was to restore and preserve balance. This remains the purpose of the Bretton Woods institutions. Yet everywhere we look across the international system today, we see imbalance. The good news, it doesn't have to be this way. My goal this morning is to outline a blueprint to restore equilibrium to the global financial system and the institutions designed to uphold it. I have spent the bulk of my career from the outside looking in on financial policy circles. Now I am on the inside looking out. I am eager to work with each of you to restore order to the international system. To achieve this, however, we must first reconstruct the IMF and World Bank reconnect the IMF and the World Bank with their founding missions. The IMF and World Bank have enduring value, but mission creep has knocked these institutions off course. We must enact key reforms to ensure the Bretton Woods institutions are serving their stakeholders, not the other way around. Bringing balance back to global finance will require clear-eyed leadership from the IMF and World Bank. This morning, I will explain how they can provide that leadership to build safer, stronger, and more prosperous economies all around the world. I wish to invite my international counterparts to join us in working toward these goals. On this point, I wish to be clear. America first does not mean America alone. To the contrary, it is a call for deeper collaboration and mutual respect among trade partners. Far from stepping back, America First seeks to expand U.S. leadership in international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. By embracing a stronger leadership role, America First seeks to restore fairness to the international economic system. Nowhere is the imbalance I mentioned earlier more obvious than in the world of trade. That's why the United States is taking action now to rebalance global commerce. For decades, successive administrations relied on faulty assumptions that our trading partners would implement policies that would drive a balanced global economy. Instead, we face the stark reality of large and persistent U.S. deficits as a result of an unfair trading system. Intentional policy choices by other countries have hollowed out America's manufacturing sector and undermined our critical supply chains, putting our national and economic security at risk. President Trump has taken strong actions to address these imbalances and the negative impacts they have on Americans. This status quo of large and persistent imbalances is not sustainable. It is not sustainable for the United States, and ultimately, it is not sustainable for other economies. Now, I know sustainability is a popular term around here, but I'm not talking about climate change or carbon footprints. I'm talking about economic and financial stability, the kind of sustainability that raises standards of living and keeps markets afloat. International financial institutions must be singularly focused on upholding this kind of sustainability if they are to succeed in their missions. In response to President Trump's tariff announcements, more than 100 countries have approached us, wanting to help rebalance global trade. These countries have responded openly and positively to the President's actions to create a more balanced international system. We are engaged in meaningful discussions and look forward to talking with others. China, in particular, is in need of a rebalancing. Recent data shows the Chinese economy tilting even further away from consumption toward manufacturing. China's economic system, with growth driven by manufacturing exports, will continue to create even more serious imbalances with its trading partners if the status quo is allowed to continue. China's current economic model is built on exporting its way out of its economic troubles. It's an unsustainable model that is not only harming China, but the entire world. China needs to change. The country knows it needs to change. Everyone knows it needs to change, and we want to help it change because we need rebalancing too. China can start by moving its economy away from export overcapacity and towards supporting its own consumers and domestic demand. Such a shift would help with global rebalancing that the world desperately needs. Of course, trade is not the only factor in broader global economic imbalances. The persistent over-reliance on the United States for demand is resulting in an ever more unbalanced global economy. Some countries' policies encourage excess savings, which holds back private sector-led growth. Others keep wages artificially depressed, which also suppresses growth. These practices contribute to global dependence on U.S. demand to spur growth. They also lead to a global economy that is weaker and more vulnerable than it should be. In Europe, former ECB President Mario Draghi has identified several sources of stagnation, and he has outlined several recommendations to get the European economy back on the right track. European countries would do well to take his recommendations to heart. Europe has already taken some long overdue initial steps that I applaud. These steps create a new source of global demand and also involve Europe stepping up on the security front. I believe global economic relationships should come to reflect security partnerships. Security partners are more likely to have compatible economies structured for mutually beneficial trade. If the United States continues offering security guarantees and open markets, then our allies must step up with stronger commitments to shared defense. The initial actions from Europe on increased fiscal and defense spending are proof that the Trump administration's policies are indeed working. The Trump administration and the U.S. Treasury are committed to maintaining and expanding U.S. economic leadership in the world. This is especially true at the international financial institutions. The IMF and World Bank serve critical roles in the international system, and the Trump administration is eager to work with them so long as they can stay true to their missions. And under the status quo, they are falling short. The Bretton Woods institutions must step back from their sprawling and unfocused agendas, which have stifled their ability to deliver on their core mandates. Going forward, the Trump administration will leverage U.S. leadership and influence at these institutions and push them to accomplish their very important mandates. The United States will also demand that the management and staffs of these institutions be accountable for demonstrating real progress. I invite all of you to join us in working to refocus these institutions on their core missions. It is in our collective interest to do so. The IMF. First, we must make the IMF again. The IMF's mission is to promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate the balanced growth of international trade, encourage economic growth, and discourage harmful policies like competitive exchange rate depreciation. These are crucially important functions to support the U.S. and global economies. Instead, the IMF has suffered from mission creep. The IMF was once unwavering in its mission of promoting global monetary cooperation and financial stability. Now it devotes disproportionate time and resources to work on climate change, gender, and social issues. These issues are not the IMF's mission. And the IMF's focus in these areas is crowding out its work on critical macroeconomic issues. The IMF must be a brutal truth teller and not just to some members. Today, the IMF has been whistling past the graveyard. Its 2024 external sector report was entitled Imbalances Receding. This Pollyannish outlook is symptomatic of an institution more dedicated to preserving the status quo than answering the hard questions. Here in the United States, we know we need to get our fiscal house in order. The last administration ran up the largest peacetime deficit in our nation's history. The current administration is committed to fixing this. We are open to critique, but we will not abide the IMF failing to critique the countries that most need it, principally surplus countries. In line with its core mandate, the IMF needs to call out countries like China that have pursued globally distorted policies and opaque currency practices for many decades. I also expect the IMF to call out unsustainable lending practices by certain creditor countries. The IMF should push more proactively official bilateral lenders to come to the table early to work with borrower countries to minimize periods of debt distress. The IMF must refocus its lending on addressing balance of payment problems, and its lending should be temporary. When done responsibly, IMF lending is at the very core of its contribution to the global economy. When markets fail, the IMF steps in and makes resources available. In exchange, countries implement economic reforms to resolve their balance of payments issues and support economic growth. The reforms undertaken during these programs are some of the IMF's most important contributions to a strong, sustainable, and balanced global economy. Argentina is a fitting example. I was in Argentina earlier this month to demonstrate the United States' support for the IMF efforts to help the country reset financially. Argentina deserves the IMF support because the country is making real progress toward meeting financial benchmarks, but not every country is so deserving. The IMF must hold countries accountable for implementing economic reforms, and sometimes the IMF needs to say no. The organization has no obligation to lend to countries that fail to implement reforms. Economic stability and growth should be the markers of the IMF's success, not how much money the institution lends out. World Bank. Like the IMF, the World Bank must be made fit for purpose again. The World Bank Group helps developing countries grow their economies, reduce poverty, increase private investment support, private sector job creation, and reduce dependence on foreign aid. It offers transparent and affordable long-term financing for countries to invest in their own development priorities. The bank, along with the fund, provides extensive technical support to promote debt sustainability among low-income countries, which empowers those countries to stand up to coercive and opaque lending terms from other creditors. These core functions of the World Bank complement the Trump administration's efforts to foster safer, stronger, and more prosperous economies in the United States and the world. But the bank, like the IMF, has strayed in certain respects from its initial mission. The bank should no longer expect blank checks for vapid, buzzword-centric marketing accompanied by half-hearted commitments to reform. As the bank returns to its core mission, it must use its resources as efficiently and effectively as possible, and it must do so in ways that demonstrate tangible values for all member countries. The bank can use its resources more efficiently now by focusing on increasing energy access. Business leaders the world over identify unreliable power supply as one of the primary impediments to investment. The World Bank and African Development Bank's joint Mission 300 initiative to expand energy access to 300 million more people in Africa is a welcome effort. But the World Bank must respond to countries' energy priorities and needs and focus on dependable technologies that can sustain economic growth rather than seek to meet distortionary climate finance targets. We applaud the recent announcement that the World Bank will seek to remove prohibitions on support for nuclear energy, which could revolutionize energy supply for many emerging markets. We encourage the bank to go further in giving countries access to all technologies that can provide affordable baseload generation. The World Bank must be tech neutral and prioritize affordability in energy investment. In most cases, this means investing in gas and other fossil fuel-based energy production. In other cases, this may mean investing in renewable energy coupled with systems to help manage the intermittency of wind and solar. The history of humanity teaches a simple lesson. Energy abundance sparks economic abundance. That's why the bank should encourage an all-of-the-above approach to energy development. Such an approach will make World Bank financing more effective, and it will reconnect the bank to its core mission of economic growth and poverty alleviation. In addition to increasing energy access, the World Bank can use its resources more effectively by starting to apply its graduation policy. This would allow the bank to focus on lending to poorer, less creditworthy countries. This is where World Bank support makes the biggest difference for poverty and growth. Instead, the World Bank continues to lend every year to countries that have met the criteria to graduate from World Bank borrowing. There is no justification for this continued lending. It siphons off resources from higher priorities and crowds out the development of private markets. It also disincentivizes countries' efforts to move away from dependency on the World Bank and toward job-rich, private sector-led growth. Going forward, the bank must set firm graduation timelines for countries that have long since met the graduation criteria. Treating China, the second largest country in the world, as a developing country is absurd. While it has been at the expense of many Western markets, China's rise has been rapid and impressive. If China wants to play a role in the global economy commensurate with its actual importance, then the country needs to graduate up. We welcome that. The World Bank should also implement transparent procurement policies based on best value. It must help countries move away from procurement approaches that prioritize only the lowest cost bids. Such procurement policies reward distortive and subsidized industrial policies that undermine development. They may also stifle the private sector and incentivize corruption and collusion and result in greater long-term cost. Procurement policies based on best value are better from both an efficiency and development perspective, and their robust implementation will benefit the bank and its shareholders. Related to this subject, I wish to send a strong, and I emphasize strong, message about procurement policies as regards Ukraine. No one who financed or supplied the Russian war machine will be eligible for funds earmarked for Ukraine's reconstruction. No one. To conclude, I invite our allies to work with us as we rebalance the international financial system, refocus the IMF and World Bank on their founding charters. America First means we are doubling down on our engagement with the international economic system, including at the IMF and the World Bank. A more sustainable economic system will be one that better serves the interests of the United States and all the other participants in the system. We look forward to working with all of you in this endeavor. Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us here today, and thank all of you for coming here today. I'm going to point out you have many great lines in this very meaty, comprehensive set of remarks, but you say, I wish to be clear, America First does not mean America alone. To the contrary, far from stepping back, you seek to expand U.S. leadership in international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. I must say there's a collective sigh of relief across this town right now, because the concern coming into this week is that you were going to do exactly what you said you're not going to do, which is the U.S. would withdraw, but you want to lead. What you're asking for is simply getting back to factory settings, right? Focused approach, and deal with the issues that you see are most paramount, correct?
Correct. As I said in my confirmation hearings, I think U.S. engagement with the international financial and multilateral institutions, we should engage, and we should be in it to win it for the American people and for the rest of the countries and for the client countries.
20 years ago, a senior U.S. Treasury official gave a speech very similar to this, calling on the IMF and said the IMF was asleep at the wheel and dealing with imbalances. Hank Paulson started the Strategic Economic Dialogue with the Chinese. Every Treasury Secretary since then have had an approach. So how will you do this differently, and how do you think that you'll proceed in this approach? What is your philosophy? What is your tools, and how will you execute on this?
Well, look, I think that our move toward reordering the financial or trading system is a start. I think that today, as I reaffirm our engagement, but set up a list of core principles and back to basics for the institutions, and again, being from the private sector, we want to see results, and we want to see timelines that, as you and I were talking about backstage, global rebalancing has been a topic for more than 20 years.
Long time.
And it's some countries may have a 100-year perspective. We don't.
Right. China obviously is an important part of this administration's foreign and economic policy. You'll be meeting with your Chinese counterparts. what will you tell them in the sense of how they obviously are aware that there's huge imbalances, their manufacturing capacity is enormous, especially in things like automobiles. How will you help them understand that it's not just about talking, it's about executing?
Well, look, I don't think I have to help them understand. I think they understand very well. And it's just a matter of impetus and will. So I believe I first went to Japan in 1990, 91, within 12 months of the peak of the bubble. A decade of that unwind, a decade of malaise. And then in 2012, I ran across a fellow, 2011, who was running for prime minister named Shinzo Abe, and he knew that Japan needed change and implemented it very quickly. 10 years later, more than 10 years later, Japan has had a remarkable economic run, and I think that our Chinese counterparts that will come to this realization, and if some of our policies, sometimes it takes an external push.
Right.
Alternatively, what I have said previously, there is an opportunity for a big deal here, that the U.S. is looking to rebalance to more manufacturing. The identity of that would be less consumption. If China is serious on less dependence on export-led manufacturing growth and a rebalancing toward a domestic economy, I think they use the term dual circulation. Right. Well, right now it's really singular circulation. And if they want to rebalance, let's do it together. This is an incredible opportunity. And I think if Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio were to write something, he could call it a beautiful rebalancing.
Indeed. But a big part of that will also be our own fiscal imbalance. And as you mentioned, we're running deficit 6% of GDP at the top of the cycle. Not sustainable, as you yourself have pointed out. How important is it to also address our fiscal imbalance as part of this larger rebalancing?
Well, it's very important that I think most people in this room are trained economists, and everyone knows that a trade deficit emanates from three things. External trade policies, which we are intent on addressing, and the external trade policies can be tariffs, non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation, and the state subsidy of labor and means of production. Mm-hmm. So terms of trade or trade regulation is one. Two is our budget deficit. So the larger our deficit, the more it creates a demand suck, also pushes up the interest rates. And then three, the level of the dollar. We continue to have a strong dollar policy, and the dollar will adjust based on markets. Everyone asks me, well, what does a strong dollar mean? And to me, the strong dollar means having the policies in place to the deserved capital flows and have confidence. But it doesn't mean that the price on the Bloomberg screen every day. And it also has different meanings in terms of bilateral the prices. So it's really three-pronged. But Tim, to your question, I have talked about we did not get here quickly with this spending. The U.S. does not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And I have suggested, when I first met President Trump, to talk about joining his campaign 2 years ago, that we need to get back to a long-term sustainable budget deficit of something with the 3 in front of it, which works. We have 2% nominal growth, or 2% inflation, projected 1.8% growth, which I think could be much higher if we implement our economic policies.
You reaffirmed the strong dollar policy first articulated by Bob Rubin. Valerie Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s talked about the U.S. exorbitant privilege of the dollar. There are some in this town who question that privilege and actually see it as a burden. Do you see it as a privilege?
That the U.S. sits at the center of the global economy is enabled by the use of dollars, and that it's natural that the usage would come down over time. And I think that the U.S. will always, for my lifetime, be the reserve currency. I actually am not sure that anyone else wants it. I can't remember, one of the European officials said today, maybe it was Mr. de Guindos, I can't remember, said, oh, well, the euro could become a second reserve currency. Well, we've just had a substantial appreciation in the euro. For export economies, it's a lot of pressure. And look, I think that the reaffirming our belief in these international institutions is also part of that.
You mentioned the euro. You mentioned in your comments Mario Draghi's report from last year. There was the letter report. Before that, I've been spending a lot of time in Europe. There does seem to be a much more a buoyant atmosphere in Europe. They see this as an opportunity for them. I said something about a possible renaissance. I was heckled a bit, but I actually am pretty positive on Europe. Do you think this is an opportunity to shift some of that demand? The world has relied on U.S. final demand to shift some of that demand for Europe. Is this a positive time for Europe?
Look, I think it can be, and it wasn't in a straight line. It wasn't always the way a trained diplomat would have done, but I think we should all congratulate President Trump. He has done what a succession of European leaders have tried to do for the past 26 years, since the advent of the euro, that whether it's the French, the Italians, other European countries have tried to get Germany to increase their fiscal spend and drive the European economy, and that I applaud these nascent efforts, because it's a combination. It's a combination of economic stimulus, and it is a combination of burden sharing on the European continent for defense. And as I've said many times before, economic security is national security is economic security. So if this European plan works, that I applaud it. I had a private meeting with the Spanish finance minister last week, 2 weeks ago, and he said, you're going to be pleasantly surprised with where we go on military spending. And
next couple of days, or the board, in the new direction, again, back to factory settings direction. What do you want to hear from them?
Well, again, I think it's just been mission creep.
Yeah.
And just occasionally you have to trim your garden when the weeds grow. And I think that it's back to basics. What are our priorities, and how are we going to judge success?
And the World Bank, you discussed about graduating the medium-sized countries that should have graduated some time ago. That changes the commercial model of the World Bank, but obviously you think that's important, that they need to be graduated.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's just, as President Trump says, it's common sense that you can't have the second largest economy in the world. And it's as I said in my speech, I applaud their rapid growth, but you don't get both. I have a teenager who sometimes wants to be treated like a child, sometimes wants to be treated like an adult, and
I got one of those too.
Yeah. And it's an adult economy.
You mentioned energy, specifically nuclear, during the campaign, and since you've become secretary, you've talked about energy production is one of your important legs. The U.S. produces about 13 million barrels of oil a day, the largest producer in the world. What more do we need to do here, and how can the World Bank, what do they need to do more to encourage fossil fuels as well as nuclear, and I assume all the above?
Yeah. Look, the sine qua non for economic growth is energy abundance. And we need to drive the right combination of the crawl, walk, run for these countries in terms of sustainable production. But by sustainable, I mean robust and baseload, right. Not what I would call almost a luxury belief that we have in the West. Like they are worried about pumping water. They are worried about heating their homes, running their hospitals. And we've seen that the intermittency doesn't work. Even kind of in middle developed countries, maybe like South Africa, that seems to have rolling blackouts. Right. So that's not a model. We want to have a model of strong baseload and then bolting on the alternative production, as opposed to beginning with alternative production and then having this latency or intermittency that makes it impossible to industrialize.
In the final minute or two, let me just turn to financial intermediation. There's a famous adage that capitalism without capital is just another ism. The institutions you see here are important intermediaries, both in the capital markets and in other forms of financial intermediation. What is your vision, especially for the U.S., in terms of financial regulation? What do you want the industry to look like? Obviously, the capital markets, the U.S. is a crown jewel of this economy. How should we encourage that not only here, but abroad?
Well, I think that I've been getting a lot of questions on private credit. And I think that private credit is an interesting addition to the U.S. Mosaic. And it is the depth and breadth of our capital and credit markets that powers the U.S. economy. And it's the innovation there. I think that private credit's a very new and interesting part, but it is happening outside of the regulated ecosystem. Right. And I always like to say, I'm not an economist, I'm an economic historian, and I think that is a distortion of the system, and it tells me that the post-2008 regulatory corset is too tight, right, on the regulated institutions, and we want to deregulate them or make them more able to provide the opportunity to lend to the American economy and perhaps into the international economy in a smart, safe, and sound way. As we've seen, the history of financial crises is a overreaction on one side, and I think that we had a regulatory overreaction. I convened something in the U.S. called FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which convenes the regulators. And I think through partnership with the 3 U.S. banking regulators, Federal Reserve, Controller of the Currency, and the FDIC, we can come up with a system that makes the regulated financial system prosper again. And what the U.S. has that is different than most other G7 countries is just the number of financial institutions. We don't have 5 big banks, 3 big banks. And in the U.S., the community and small banks, which are provide 70% of agricultural lending, right, 40% of small business lending, 40% of real estate lending. And in the U.S., we've had this incredible boom on Wall Street. I think Wall Street can continue doing well. But I think it's Main Street's turn to share in the prosperity. And I think it was the pullback by the small banks, the post the GFC, that's kind of created this stagnation on Main Street. And we're determined to fix that.
Mr. Secretary, I always say Treasury is the sober voice of reason. What we've heard today from you is a sober voice of reason. We wish you all the best. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Treasury Secretary.
Thank you.